we had some audio complications before. We tried to record a show earlier this month, but I wanted to make sure I got you back on. Today, we're going to be talking all about China and the many misconceptions that Americans and Westerners in general share about the country. I think you have a very nuanced perspective having lived in China. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to have it. Yes, I studied Asian politics in college, and then I lived there for a while. I'm married into a Chinese family, and I've written about it, made videos about it in the past. I actually just had a guest on my show who has written books about it and stuff. But it's something I've done a lot of writing and thinking about in recent times.
Great. Well, I think I just want to go ahead and start by asking you, as a person that comes from a more of a socialist and communist background, do you feel like the notion that China is a communist country is incorrect or at best misguided?
hmm well, first of all, I wouldn't identify myself as a socialist or communist. I think I'm more of a social democrat, although I joke that I feel like I'm getting closer to being a socialist every day. Um, so this is one of those things, and I think this is very true in foreign policy in general, and especially in a place like China, is that things are nuanced. Um, and technically, yes, China is one of the 5 remaining communist countries. That would be China, Laos, Vietnam, North Korea, and Cuba. And they are ruled by the Communist Party of China or Chinese Communist Party. There's a little bit of a disagreement in the West about what's the correct translation. The Chinese word is Zhongguo Gongchongdong, but Chinese grammar is a little different. So that actually means like China Communist Party, but Chinese Communist Party is the one I use. So most of the political leadership, if you ask them, they would tell you that they're communists. They would tell you that they're Marxist-Leninists. But there's a lot of people that say that they're not really practicing a communist system. A word that we use in political science a lot is state capitalism. But I don't know that it's really accurate to say that they're either capitalist or communist. First of all, if we're really speaking specifically, no country has ever been communist, because the whole idea of communism is that it is stateless, moneyless, and classless, and that has never existed. And in fact, it can't exist in a single country. It has to be like a worldwide thing. So even like the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam have always identified as socialist countries ruled by communist parties, where the word communist in the name of the party was more of like an aspiration.
Right.
And so China would identify as a socialist country and definitely has a lot of socialist characteristics. But ever since the Deng Xiaoping era, who was the paramount leader of China after Mao Zedong died, they've taken on more and more capitalistic characteristics. And what most political scientists today would describe them as is what's called state capitalism, which is a system where corporations exist and private business exist, but corporations are extremely powerful in China. But generally speaking, corporations are kind of controlled by the state. Most major corporations in China have at least partial state ownership, even if they're not state-owned corporations. For example, Sinopec, which is the largest oil company in China, and not only controls extraction of oil, but also the sale of oil. It's a fully state-owned corporation, or State Grid Corporation is in China. The State Grid Corporation of China is a fully state-owned corporation, but also companies like Huawei, which are act largely as private companies, have significant state ownership. And so it's almost like saying authoritarian capitalism.
Sounds like
Not
fascism.
So not totally. So fascism is very much about fascism always has ethnic and racial flair. And that isn't as true in the Chinese system. Of course, racism exists in every single country in the world.
Right.
But it's not like largely with exclusions of like the genocide of the Uyghurs, the whole overriding motive of the Chinese government is not ethnic nationalism, whereas it's not oppression of ethnic minorities, whereas in a fascist system, that would often be the primary driver. In Nazi Germany, everything was built around the Jewish question, every action that the government took.
I
And that's
see.
not true in China. It's it's really more like where the government is the primary capitalist.
So is it? I've often heard people say that there's really no such thing as a private business in China. Is that an accurate statement?
So
Or
there's
is it just
Starbucks and
really like case by case?
there's Starbucks and there's Walmart and there's McDonald's, all the foreign brands that we know that we would recognize as these corporate giants in America. And there's also there's a ton of Chinese companies. There's Huawei, there's Xiaomi, there's Luckin Coffee and all of that. There are a lot of regulations that make the businesses, I guess you could call them, less private. Part of that is that a lot of businesses do have partial state ownership. A lot of times foreign companies are required to either spin off a subsidiary, a Chinese subsidiary, or to partner with a Chinese company when they come into the country. Tesla actually got an exclusion for that recently when they opened up their factory, where they got a one-time only for Tesla exclusion where they don't have to partner with a foreign company. But generally speaking, you can't operate fully independently as a foreign company in China. You have to have some ties with either the government or existing companies, which usually have ties with the government. So the government does kind of have their fingers in every pot.
Yeah, I could see how that could kind of be controversial because I've often heard people on the Western side of things talking about like, hey, like why do we have our tech companies like Google in China? Because they're effectively just operating on behalf of the Chinese government, doing whatever they want, engaging in censorship and all those other things. But you're absolutely right. If those companies want to exist in China, they have to obey by the rules set forth by the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Chinese government's very strict about foreigners and foreign companies following their rules. When I went there, there's this whole thing foreigners have to do that. So this applies to foreign individuals, not just foreign companies. We have to go in and it's at like a police headquarters, regional district police headquarters. Like it would be like a borough, like Manhattan.
Okay.
Um, and they'll get all the foreigners that arrived in this 1 month period in that district in an auditorium, and they spend like 3 hours telling us about all the rules and like everything that could happen if we break the rules. And they are very strict about everyone following rules, but especially foreigners, because they have a bad history of Westerners coming in and trying to exploit China or dictate to China. And that's largely part of what their cultural identity is now, and at least politically. What the political drivers are is what they call the century of humiliation, which was between the end of the Opium Wars in the 1840s
Mhm.
and the institution of the People's Republic in the 1940s. Which was a period where like every Western power, not just Western powers, Japan, but Japan, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, Germany, every foreign power was coming in and taking out their slices of China, extracting as much cash out of China as they possibly could, with very little regard for what was happening to the Chinese. And so that's a big part of their political driver now, both with their domestic policy around how foreigners and foreign companies are regulated, but also their foreign policy about wanting to be strong enough that no foreign country can ever come in and exploit them like that again. But yeah, foreign companies can't, like, Google hardly exists in China. Most Google products are unavailable. Google Maps is actually one of the only major exceptions. But like the foreign companies, that Apple, the foreign companies that are able to come into China, they can't just do whatever they want. They can't just say, oh, we don't believe in this what you're doing here, so we're going to go back against it, because they'll just get kicked out of the country. They'll lose their business.
Yeah, I mean, and the same exact standards I think would apply with the American government, right? If a foreign company wanted to operate in America
Mm-hmm.
and they were
Yeah,
doing
you've got to follow
something,
American laws.
yeah, exactly. Like they're not
Yeah,
going to be able, oh,
and we're going to look at Chinese laws as more authoritarian, because often they are, but they are at the end of the day laws that foreign companies have to follow.
right.
And also, I think that a lot of times we have this idea that like, oh, well, they don't have anything to replace our companies. They can't, if Apple pulls out, where are they going to get their cell phones?
Oh,
But
yeah, that is such a myth.
yeah, like and also they keep disproving it, because every time there is an industry where there's not really a major Chinese company, these companies keep popping up that are Chinese companies that are doing these things. They have their own cell phone manufacturers, their own cell phone providers. They have their own internet companies. They have their own versions of YouTube and Google. And like every one of these tech things, they have their own like 12 different electric car brands. And they're actually way ahead of us in electric cars.
Yeah, I could
But
definitely
they
see
have,
that.
yeah, like they're an enormous country, and that's becoming wealthier by the day.
Hmm.
You can't expect this enormous country that's like 1/6 of the world's population to not have its own corporations. Of course, they
Yeah,
have their own
absolutely not.
innovators and their own companies. They're making their own products. So
Hmm.
they kind of have the attitude of, yeah, follow our rules, obviously, and if you don't want to follow our rules, we'll do it ourselves. And so when people look at these companies that are cooperating, what's the other option if they want to maintain that market? And being capitalist companies, they're not going to just pull out of the second largest consumer market in the world. That would be a terrible business decision, and they are, at the end of the day, for-profit companies. So you can make your own moral judgments about that, but from their own cost-benefit analysis, that's the only obvious option.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think their argument's kind of ridiculous. Okay, so kind of going along the lines of what we're talking about now. So a lot of people might respond to what you said about China being not a or you said they were a communist country.
It's
S-
it's
It,
complicated. They would call themselves a communist country. They have communist characteristics and they have capitalist characteristics. They would call themselves socialist country. They would call themselves communists.
okay, so yeah, going off that, I want to ask you then, is it really this authoritarian hellhole that people really make it out to be, where civil liberties are suppressed? And
Mhm.
can you talk about the reality of the situation? How do Chinese civil liberties compare to American ones?
So that's also got some more nuance, because authoritarian, yes. Hellhole, no. Um, so China is a very authoritarian country. On the democracy index, they rank 156th out of 167 countries. So with a score of 2.26, which is very low on that scale. They don't have elections, only within the party. They don't have mass elections. And freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly of the press don't really exist in the way that we think of it. You can be arrested for sedition or undermining the government. Religions are foreign religions are tolerated as long as they're not seen as undermining the state. But then if you have something like the Falun Gong is a famous example of that, where they believed that this was a dangerous thing, and so they banned it. It is a cult. I've made a video about that. So civil liberties don't really exist the way that we think of them in the West.
Hmm.
But also, I think in the West, we have this conception that everyone who lives in an authoritarian state must be just hating that and clamoring at the door for democracy. And if we just give it a push, then the whole system will fall over and people will rise up and demand their freedom. And that's not really true in China. China's kind of different than what we think of as a normal authoritarian country. A lot of authoritarian countries, and I don't call it a dictatorship because a dictatorship implies absolute power to a single person, whereas Xi Jinping, the president of China, although he has immense power, is a part of a wider state apparatus. So he doesn't have absolute power. He still relies on the National Assembly, the Politburo Standing Committee, and the party, the Communist Party. A lot of authoritarian countries have this like patina of being a democracy. They try to pretend they're a democracy. Uganda is a good example of that, where they recently had an election. This is a podcast, so you can't see the air quotes, but I'm putting air quotes around election. But it's widely been condemned as neither free nor fair. There's a lot of political violence leading up to it. It's not really considered to be, it basically it's rigged. Russia has elections, but I think that people generally are aware that Russia is an authoritarian state and Vladimir Putin is pretty close to a dictator. But China doesn't pretend to be a democracy. China recognizes that they're an authoritarian state, and instead what they do is they say, no, this is what's best for us.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. I was going to say, doesn't the government actually actively promote that message? Because they essentially make the argument, look, we're the largest country in the world by population, so we effectively need an authoritarian style government to maintain control over the population.
Yes, the Chinese government promotes the message that democracy is a flawed system, and that democracy has all these issues. They go, it's messy and it's inefficient. It doesn't get things done. And things like what just happened in Washington, D.C. a couple weeks ago, that's a perfect messaging opportunity for them.
Yeah.
But they admit that they are an authoritarian state, but they say that that's what's best for them. And people are generally fine with that. One thing you have to consider is, first of all, that China has, I want to say 4,000 years of recorded Chinese history, and only for like 100 of those years was China a democracy.
Wow.
Maybe less than that. Maybe it was more like 70 years, but yeah, less than a century, I think, that China was a democracy. And that was between the Chinese Revolution in 1920. And so that would only be like, no, I'm trying to remember what year the Chinese Revolution was. It was early 20th century.
1949?
No, that was the Civil War. So, which is a different thing.
Got it.
So the Chinese Revolution, where the emperor was overthrown. It was somewhere in the early 20th century.
Okay.
I want to say like 1920, and going to 1949 when the People's Republic of China was declared. And even then, for large parts of that, you can like debate how much of a democracy it actually was. Chiang Kai-shek, who was the president for a long period of time during that period, was not a super democratic guy. He was very corrupt, and there was probably a lot of election rigging going on. But with the exception of that period, China has always been an authoritarian state. It was a monarchy for thousands of years, and then it became the People's Republic. And that period of democracy, for anyone who does remember that, which most people don't because it was a long time ago, but for anyone who does remember that, they'll remember that it was one of the worst periods of Chinese history. It was a period where the country basically broke into pieces, and they were invaded by the Japanese, and millions of people died, and there was famines and civil wars, and it was just terrible corruption. And if they look at their lives, which most people won't even be old enough to have meaningful memories of the Mao Zedong era, which was much worse than what is today. Most people's meaningful memories, their adulthood and their adolescence, will be after Mao died, because he died in 1976, I think it was.
Yes.
And so they'll look at that and they'll see a country that's gotten more prosperous every single year of their life, and has grown more prosperous more quickly than we can even really comprehend as Westerners.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Like if you look at satellite imagery of China just over the course of like the last 25, 30 years, how quickly they've developed.
Yeah, and if they look at their their childhood, they'll see a country that was relatively undeveloped. If they're a little bit older, they might be old enough to remember things like the Great Chinese Famine, which was a pretty awful period. But then they'll look at themselves today, where people have nice apartments and everyone has a cell phone. They can send their kids to good schools. People don't have to worry about their health care.
I was just
People
going to
don't,
ask you about healthcare. Do they have free healthcare in China?
not completely free, but extremely cheap.
Okay. Much cheaper
Yeah,
and more
yeah. So
accessible than in
like,
the US.
yeah, you'll usually have to pay some small amount, but it will be like a small amount. Like something that is so small that it's not, almost everyone can reasonably afford that. Only the poorest of the poor would not really be able to afford it. And so people don't have to worry about their healthcare. They don't have to worry about their retirement because they have a very generous, what we would call socialist security. They call it social insurance. A very generous one. Their retirement age is actually 60 for men and 55 for women, which is, as you know, in America, it's 65, and a lot of people want to make it higher. And people can travel, but they have much better lives than they had even 5 years ago. And they see that things are continuously getting better, and people largely credit the government with that. And so they say, hey, this authoritarian thing seems to be working out just fine. So
Right.
I'm not particularly upset. Chinese people are very patriotic. Like, they generally love their country. They have a lot of pride in the things their country has achieved, and their country has a lot of history. For most of human history, China was the most powerful country in the world. For all of human history, recorded history at least, China was the largest country in the world. And they have yeah, I feel like in America we underestimate how much pride foreigners have in their own countries. And even people in smaller, poorer countries where they don't have as high of a standard of living, oftentimes people are like, oh no, I'm very proud to be Jordanian. I'm very proud to be Ghanaian or Nigerian.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I think Americans often forget that the vast majority of the time that people immigrate to the United States, it's because they're forced to. It's not because they want to get up and leave their country. Or, I mean, not necessarily forced to, I guess, but that's the main reason.
but like
Another reason might be, yeah, they might be chasing schooling or
yeah.
work.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Yeah,
oftentimes it
it's
is in times of desperation.
yeah, it's very commonly because there's better economic opportunities, like a better way to support your family. What a lot of immigrants do is they send money back to their home countries, to their families in their home countries. Um, yeah, so is China an authoritarian country? Yes, but I don't think authoritarian and hellhole are the same thing.
Right.
There's still generally a lower standard of living than what we would than what exists in the West, but it's catching up quickly, and it's much better than what most people are used to. And I mean, there's a lot of programs in China that are more generous than what we have in America. Like we just talked about, the healthcare and the social insurance. As far as terrified of the government, I think people are like, have an attitude of like, don't mess with the government, because it's like they know that it's powerful. They know that the government is something that shouldn't be trifled with. But people don't like live in terror of like, oh, the government's gonna come get me any day now. They kind of have the attitude of like, no, I mean, I don't break the rules, so the government,
No,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
I'm a
be fine.
law-abiding citizen. I
Yeah.
don't really have anything to worry about. Okay.
Yeah, there's not the same problems with police brutality. There's an organization called the Chengguan, which is a kind of enforcement of like street vendor permits and like when people dump trash, like, you know, like little municipal things. And they have a bad reputation because for the first decade of their existence, there was a lot of incidents where they were abusing their power and like they assaulted people and stuff. There's been reform now, so that there hasn't been major incidents with them since I think 2014. But there's not all, you know, there's not a video every month of some person getting shot by police. Now that's not to say that that's not to say that it's okay that people think it's okay to just go and like be like, oh, fuck the state, I'm gonna rebel, or I'm gonna go and break all the laws because they won't do anything to me. No, people know that they'll get in trouble, that they'll get in a lot of trouble. And
Yeah, I mean, your actions have consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, like, people know that there are things that are acceptable in the West, like a lot of political speech and stuff that are not acceptable in China, but they just largely don't take part in that. And if they do, then they're very careful about it.
Okay. I wanted to move on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
So oddly enough, some Americans still think of China, modern China, that is, as the same way they think of North Korea, a country where there's a lot of propaganda. People don't really have any knowledge of the outside world. Can you comment on whether or not this is accurate and why you think so many Americans still think that China is the same country that it was in the 60s?
So, you know what's funny is when I first got to China, you'll hear like automated messages on megaphones all the time. And kind of like what you see in North Korea documentaries, like when Lisa Ling, was it Lisa Ling or Laura Ling that went to North Korea? One of them one of them was a prisoner in North Korea, and then the other sister did the documentary. I'm thinking the one who did the documentary, like in all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And my first assumption when I got there was, oh, this is like state propaganda that they're broadcasting across the airways. It turns out, because China is a much more capitalistic country than North Korea, this is actually advertisements. So people will have, they'll get like motorcycles and stuff, and they'll get a megaphone with an automated message, and they'll like drive the motorcycles around playing this automated message that if you could understand the Chinese, you'd realize that it's advertisements. Or like 7-Eleven will put a megaphone outside their door with like talking about the sales that they're having and stuff. And
Yeah, and there's like billboards for Western media and things that
Mhm.
we have in the US everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Like and
Mm.
people in China are able to freely leave and go as they want.
Yeah. So to answer your question, to give I think all the answers to almost all of these are going to be just there's nuance. Um, and there's kind of a mixture of there is state propaganda. The domestic news outlets are all state run. And there is censorship in social media, there's censorship in the media. But at the same time, people do generally know what's going on and what's going on outside of the country if they're interested in that. Like in any country, there are going to be a lot of people who aren't interested in the news.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're interested in that, people can figure that out. There is some access in domestic outlets to foreign news stories, and they do report on a lot of things. Most things they'll report on sometimes with a lens, but they will be reporting on it usually. And if they do want to access foreign outlets, VPNs are always an option. That's illegal, but that doesn't stop people generally. I know I was just talking about people following rules, but according to his survey from PC Magazine that I found, 31% of people in China use a VPN at least once a month. And they are relatively ubiquitous, especially amongst young people. Young people use them at a much higher rate than older people. There's another funny story about that. So around National Day, I noticed that I was using NordVPN, not to put that company on blast, but around National Day, NordVPN went down, and all the VPNs went down. And all the people that had ExpressVPN, it went up after like a week or two. NordVPN, it was down forever. I was using my backup VPN to upload my YouTube videos and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but they just never got it down. And you go to their website and it even says like, because of Chinese National Day, it's down. But I thought that was a little bit funny, where it's like the government saying, "Hey, we can shut this down anytime we want. we
Yeah.
we let you do this."
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so VPNs are pretty commonly used, and so people can get access to that. There is kind of a distrust of foreign news, not in the sense that they think it's necessarily fake, but in the sense that a lot of people think it might be selective.
Mm.
Whereas they'll say, okay, our news only gives kind of a negative view of America or Britain or whatever,
Yeah.
I'm going to assume that your news is also only giving a negative view, like selectively giving a negative view of our
I mean,
country.
and there is a lot of truth to that. I
Yeah,
don't
there is a
often
lot of
hear
truth to that.
mainstream media saying positive news stories about China and places like Iran and Russia, you know,
Yeah.
supposedly enemies of the US.
Yeah, and so yeah, everything is nuanced. Like state propaganda exists and censorship is widespread.
Mhm.
But if you really want to find out what's going on, it's not that hard to do.
Can you find can you find adequate information about Tiananmen Square
So
while in China?
I haven't personally tried to do that. I do know that it's not like something that's it was a big news story at the time,
Mhm.
but it's not something that's really taught as a piece of history. I think that this my personal experience is that most people are like vaguely aware that it's happened, but that it was like a thing that happened a long time ago, and it's kind of like if there's a lot of like things that we're vaguely aware of happening in American history in the past, and it's almost better known in the West than it is in China.
And that's by design, right?
I think so. I mean, if you're going to use a VPN to go and get Western media, most people aren't doing it so they can read the Wikipedia pages
Yeah,
of
I would not think so.
Tiananmen Square and the Great Famine and whatnot. Most people are like, no, I either lived through that or have some vague memories of it. I'm going to use the Western news outlets to watch YouTube,
Yeah, that
or
makes
to
more
read
sense, of
CNN or
course.
whatever.
Mhm.
So it's definitely not something that's taught about. And I've never personally tried to like search it on Baidu without a VPN in China. I wouldn't imagine that you would have that much um, objective like history-based reporting. If there is any, I can't personally say
Yeah, I
what the
mean,
level of access to that is.
yeah, I mean, I've seen some videos on it. I'm not sure the like how accurate it is, but they say that when you look up certain aspects of it, the images are just blurred or they're censored or there are just large gaps in information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do know it's like, I mean, I know it's something that was reported on at the time because I know that there are people who remember it happening.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago. It was in 1989.
Yeah, which was quite a while ago, but
I mean,
not
not long
an
enough where
insanely
people,
amount of time,
yeah,
long time
a lot
ago.
of people alive today would
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
know about it. Okay, moving on. Why do people think of China as one large homogenous country when it consists of so many different ethnic minority groups? I think there's 56, right?
There are 56 recognized I recognize minorities and 57 recognized ethnic groups because Han is one of the recognized ethnic groups, and that's the majority ethnic
Hmm.
group. So I guess the reason people think of it as a large homogenous country is largely because it is a large homogenous country. So there are 56 recognized minorities, but Han are 93.94% of the population. The second largest ethnic group in China, which is the Zhuang, is 1.13% of the population. And then it gets progressively smaller and smaller. Like Zhuang is significantly larger than the third largest, and it
Hmm.
gets progressively smaller and smaller. There are over 300 languages that exist in China, and some
Wow.
number of those have official recognition. But 71% of people speak Mandarin as their first language, and 92% of people speak some form of Chinese. These forms of Chinese are not exactly the same. Cantonese is the most famous. Shanghainese is one of the big ones. But I've heard them compared to like English to Dutch to German, where they're related but not necessarily mutually intelligible. But even for people who don't speak Mandarin as a first language, Mandarin is generally used as a lingua franca. So like if you are a Shanghainese speaker and you're speaking to someone who's not also a Shanghainese speaker, you'll probably speak Mandarin to them.
Okay.
There's 5 recognized religions, but The non-religious are 73.56% of the population. And so like, it's like there is this large amount of diversity, but the majority makes up a huge majority. Like I said, Han are just one of those 57 ethnic groups, but that one ethnic group is 93.94% of the population. And all of the minority ethnic groups, not all of them, but most of the minority ethnic groups are largely regionalized. So like the Zhuang I talked about, that are the second largest ethnic group, they live almost exclusively in Guangxi province. The Uyghurs live almost exclusively in Xinjiang, Tibetans in Tibet. Koreans live almost exclusively in the Dongbei provinces, what in the West we often call Manchuria, near the Korean border.
Mm.
And so if you are not living in, if you're living in one of the big coastal cities, it'll seem like even more than 93% of the population is Han, because most of the 7% or 6.1% of the population that's not Han is living in regions that are have larger populations of that ethnic group.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Okay, so stepping away from politics, I was interested in learning now more about Chinese food. I've often heard that American Chinese food is significantly different than Chinese food in China. Is there any truth to this, and which one do you prefer?
So I think that American Chinese food is not like a totally different thing. It is different, but it's not like a totally different thing. Like I think a lot of people like to frame it as, where they're
Mhm.
like, "Oh, American Chinese food isn't the same as Chinese food." And yeah, that's true, but it's not like comparing Chinese food to Italian food.
Right, they're
Like yeah, it's
vastly different.
I think what happened is that American Chinese food was created by taking Chinese food and like making it more suitable to American palates. The
Mhm.
same thing that happened with curries in Britain, where like curry in the United Kingdom is not the same as curry in India because it was adapted to the British palate. Um,
Some nice
funny story.
colonization.
Yeah, a funny story. So my mother likes to make stir fries where she'll throw in like 12 different ingredients and like water chestnuts and baby corns and all this stuff. Oh, in my household, we make stir fries with like 3, 4 ingredients
Mhm.
because we're making it more like what's made in China.
Right.
Um, it's hard to say if you like prefer one or the other because Chinese food is a whole cuisine with hundreds or thousands of dishes. But
Mhm.
I do notice that when I'm eating Chinese food in China, I'm eating some of the more like the ones that are more similar to American Chinese food. And I think that's because American Chinese food is like suited to the American palate. And I
Mm.
am an American with an American palate. So
Mhm.
there we go. Like I end up eating, of stir fries and like, chicken dishes and stuff, dumplings. There are a whole lot of other similar to dumpling foods that are very nice. There's one called baozi, which is kind of like a steamed bun.
Mhm.
It's kind of like if you had a dumpling with a very thick, fluffy shell. There's another one called sharbin, which is kind of like if you took a baozi and then you squished it, and instead of steaming it, you fried it. But all kinds of like bread with meat filling things that are very nice.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
So the previous question, I remembered what I wanted to ask you. Um, do you speak Mandarin Chinese?
I may speak maybe a couple dozen words. I definitely wouldn't say that I speak Chinese.
Okay, so then when you were in China, you were taking classes that were taught in English?
Yeah, so well, I was teaching English, so I was
Oh,
teaching
right. You weren't
classes
taking
that were in
classes, you were
English.
teaching. Okay.
Yes.
That's interesting. um,
Although I did know people who were studying at local colleges there. Often they were studying Chinese, and so they would um, a lot of the times they would have classes that were taught in English, because it's kind of like classes tailored towards foreigners. Um, there were a few brave people who did the all Chinese classes. But that wasn't a common thing. Mostly people were learning Chinese in college. I did know one person who decided to take Korean classes. She was from Ireland, and what made that especially difficult, though, was because the teacher, instead of speaking English out of Korean like they would in the Chinese classes often, she would speak Chinese out of Korean. And so my friend, she had like a rudimentary, it's much better Chinese than me. She could speak like rudimentary Chinese, like enough
Mm-hmm.
to like, have a simple conversation, but all of a sudden she's hearing academic level Chinese to explain Korean. And so she's learning a third language in a language that she just like kind of knows, which was apparently very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound easy at all.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ian, as a person who's had the opportunity to live in China and the US, where have you felt the safest? I've heard some of the large Chinese cities, such as Shanghai, are safer at 2 a.m. than, say, Dallas would be at 1 p.m.
So I'm a straight cisgendered white male, which naturally makes me never feel that unsafe in a city.
That's an excellent
I,
point.
yeah, I joke that we have this kind of American confidence where my father is also he's from South Africa. He's an American citizen now, but he was originally from South Africa. And so a lot of foreigners have this like when they go through customs, it's kind of like a nervous experience. And my mother and I were talking to him about that. And we were joking that we have this American confidence where we walk up to a customs desk like we own the place. Like, no, of course you're going to let me into the country. I'm American. What are you talking about? But yeah, so yeah, no, China's not unsafe. So there's problems like not unlike what you would experience here, where like there's sexual harassment on subways. I've heard women talk about like creepy guys groping them on the subway, but I know that happens here as well. Not having guns, I think, is a big thing where people that's not a concern at all, because even in countries that do have like, there are countries like France or Britain or Canada where guns are illegal generally speaking, but you can still get one if you really try to. In
Mhm.
China, it would be virtually impossible to get a gun if you're not a member of the military or police. And so there's virtually zero risk of gun violence. I think the biggest thing about whether you feel safe as a Westerner living in China is about how you look at the surveillance state. That's a word that's been thrown about a lot to describe China and increasingly other countries like Saudi Arabia and such now.
Well, I think the U.S. is a
Where,
surveillance state.
yeah, you could definitely make that argument. But it's like if you go to China, there's every traffic intersection will have 24 cameras. God knows how many of those are facial recognition cameras. I've seen
Right.
things where
And
they
don't they have
can.
like guards everywhere?
Yeah, so a lot of them are not police, actually. A lot of them are like private companies, like kind of, rent-a-cop's private security.
Mm-hmm.
I think rent-a-cop might be a derogatory term, so sorry to any private security listeners there, but private security
So they're not
is what I mean.
representing the state then?
A lot of them are hired by, so a lot of them are hired by the state, actually. So like the ones that guard the subways are hired by the local government, but
Mm-hmm.
do work for a third party. A lot of them will be hired by companies that have offices there, like banks and like phone shops and whatnot, places that have valuable things that might get robbed.
Right.
So there are a lot of security guards all over the place. A lot of them aren't police. Um, it is if you're when you first see the PAP, which is the People's Armed Police, that can, I would imagine, can be pretty disconcerting to a lot of foreigners. So the PAP, the People's Armed Police, is kind of like a paramilitary wing of like national police. It's kind of like SWAT teams, but they wear camouflage like military uniforms, and they have rifles and shotguns a lot of the times, and they'll drive around in almost like MRAPs, which are those like armored trucks that you see riot squads and SWAT teams in America use a lot, but they have them painted green and white, and they just kind of drive around in those, and then train stations, airports, government offices. You'll see the PAP guarding things there. And so I can imagine that a lot of foreigners would probably be a little disconcerted the first time that you see them drive by in their armored trucks, but you get used to it pretty quickly. But like I was saying, I think it's largely about how you look at the surveillance state. About you pretty quickly know that you're being watched or can be watched at any moment. And so some people look at it as something that is an invasion of their privacy, and some people look at that as something that is there to keep them safe. And so I guess that's largely about how you view that aspect, whether that's going to make you feel safe or not.
Yeah, I guess it's just a mindset thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever your philosophical mindset is towards that issue.
There's I don't think that there's much danger of interpersonal violence. I mean, at the end of the day, people are people, and like there are bad people in China, and there are people who will want to rob you or want to commit violence in China too. There is a lot more of a because of the surveillance states and the police states, I think that there's a lot more of an idea of like it's harder to get away with these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is pretty low crime rates in China, like relative to America.
Do they have like agencies similar to like the CIA and the FBI?
Well, of course, every country has intelligence agencies, and China, I think that we're being naive if we don't think that every major country is spying on every other major country, and even that like middle powers are largely spying on each other. Like if we don't think that there are a ton of Chinese, Russian, even like German spies in America, then I think we're being naive. And I think that we're also being naive if we don't think that there are a ton of American spies in China and Russia and even Germany.
Mm-hmm.
I think every country spies on each other. So of course there's an intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, and the more technology progresses, the easier it makes it, I think.
Yeah, and as far as the FBI, they do have a national police force. Here, I can look up the name for it because I forget the name off the top of my head. But they do have a national police force like the FBI.
What do you think is the most difficult thing for Americans to understand about Chinese culture?
It looks like the Ministry of Public Security, by the way, is the name of the thing. So Chinese culture is very different from Western culture. I think that a lot of the times we have this idea of foreign cultures, and we look at foreign cultures that are largely influenced by European cultures, which we are one of them. So if we look at Germany or France or Italy, or even if you look at Latin America or Africa, because of colonialism, all of those cultures are pretty influenced by the same root, by Europe. And so Americans don't actually have that much cultural difference compared to Asian countries, don't have that much cultural difference with someone from Mexico or Nigeria. There are a lot of cultural differences, but we still have a lot of things in common. Whereas Asian cultures largely developed independent of Europe because some of the last bastions against colonialism were in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Thailand. And so, excuse me, Chinese culture is very different, but I think that something that people should keep in mind is that Chinese people aren't caricatures and they're not cartoons, and they are going to have individuality, and they are going to act as individuals and look out for self-interest. And like at the end of the day, people are going to worry about like their family and what's important to their own financial status and like their jobs and how are their kids doing at school and stuff, and kind of the same ideas that if what we worry about. People aren't. It's not. Chinese people aren't they don't sit around all day going, oh, my objective for today is to advance the Communist Party and take down America. No, people generally like they wake up and their objective of the day is to go to work, where they might work at like Starbucks.
And how do Chinese citizens in general view Americans?
Um, so it's a very individualized thing where I think that,
Very case by case.
yeah, it's very case by case. I don't think that it's generally negative. They probably have more negative views of
The government.
American government than they
Yeah,
do of Americans. Which again, I think is a pretty universal thing where,
I think so too. I
yeah,
mean,
where,
I
yeah, racism aside, I think that most people will look at a country and like their negative views. If they really think about what their negative views are, they'll often be focused at the government instead of the people. And sometimes people like project the government onto the whole country. But if you really sit down and think about it, and especially if you meet someone, um, then you kind of like realize, oh yeah, this person is a person and they're not the government. Um, Racism does exist in China, and I think that's like very much, you cannot notice it especially if you're part of the majority culture, if you're Han and you speak Mandarin and whatnot. To like, and then it's not really a language thing as much, but there's an idea of uh, like Han supremacy is a thing,
mm,
and I think that's going to exist again um, in any culture where there's a majority culture, and even if there isn't, like if you look at a lot of parts of Africa, there's not majority cultures, but people think that in a particular culture have a sense of superiority sometimes. Someone asked me once if I think that reverse racism is a real thing. And I said, well, I think reverse racism is kind of a stupid term because that implies that racism has a direction. That implies that like racism is a thing that white people do to other people, when in reality, in America and in the West, that's largely how we think of racism, because white people are the majority culture that has historically had all of the advantages and all of the privilege. But if you go to a place like China or Japan, then white people weren't historically the majority culture that had all the advantages and all the privilege. And so the majority culture that had all the advantages and the privileges in China is Chinese people, is Han. And so
it's a
any
westernized version of looking at racism.
yeah, it's a westernized version of looking at racism, and racism exists in every culture in every country. um
Absolutely.
and also a lot of countries don't look at race the same way we do, whereas like if you go to Africa, there would be a lot of what we would call racism between different groups of black people, that in America we would just clump them all together as black, but in Africa they're like, no, I'm not the same as that person over there.
Right, or
If you,
Sunni and Shia or something like
yeah,
that.
if you look at the Rwandan genocide, that was racism between Hutus and Tutsis, which if a Hutu and a Tutsi both came to America, the average American would just say, oh, they're black, they're the same. And
Hmm.
they're like, no, we're not the same.
Yeah,
um,
completely.
yeah. Also, something else that I think we should keep, that is kind of not something we think about in cultural differences, is that we think that values are universal sometimes, and they're not. Um, a conversation I had the other day was when I realized that Chinese traditional gender roles and American traditional gender roles, while both countries have traditional gender roles, they're not the same roles. And I was talking about traditional gender roles in parenting, where it's the whole idea of in the West that the mother is supposed to be the one that gives you love and takes care of you, whereas the father is supposed to be like standoffish and cold and like, oh yes, I never saw my father cry, but he also never hugged me, is the traditional gender role. Whereas in China,
Right.
that particular gender role doesn't exist, and it's more like yeah, no, each individual parent will have an individual personality, and we don't have expectations that like the father is going to have this emotional state and the mother is going to have this emotional state. So whereas there are like role traditional ideas of what women do and what men do, it's not necessarily the same ideas as we would have in the West.
I think that's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay, this is my last question for you.
sure.
What are some sites and landmarks that people should see while they're in China, besides, of course, the Great Wall?
So one thing I think you should definitely check out, and this is going to sound underwhelming, but just whatever parks are in the area. China does parks, like public parks, really well. There will almost always be some kind of a water feature with like big ponds, and they'll like dig canals through the parks. Will be very large often, and they'll be like walled in and gated in a lot. But they'll have big water features with fountains and lakes and ponds and canals. There'll be like beautiful, well-maintained foliage. They hire people to come in, and the government hires people to come in and maintain all the vegetation. They'll a lot of times you'll see things like sometimes there'll be like bird cages that have all kinds of exotic birds in them, and they'll have little pergolas, whatever that word is.
I've heard they have amazing animal exhibits there.
Yeah, that's the one I was gonna get to. But also, you'll another thing, and this is a little bit funny, is that you'll see like group activities, and I'm sure this is maybe not actually. I think they're from what I'm trying to remember from calling back to family. There is I believe these are back on because China's kind of got COVID under control now. But there'll be a lot of group activities in parks in China, so you'll see like groups of people exercising together. It's often a thing that older people do, like retired people, where you'll see groups of people exercising or dancing or doing Tai Chi or singing or whatever. I think that's cool. The other thing I was going to say is to see pandas. So I didn't get to go to Sichuan where you can like cuddle with the baby pandas, which I think would be great. But I did see pandas in the Beijing Zoo. And before that, I had seen pandas in the Washington, D.C. Zoo. And it was kind of like from a distance. And they had one panda that I could look at from it. And the other ones, I think they have a couple of pandas in D.C., but the other ones are like hiding somewhere, as zoo animals tend to do.
Right.
Something cool they did in Beijing was that they had like, you know how sometimes you'll go to a zoo and you'll go into a building where there's glass walls where you can look through to an exhibit. They had that for the pandas. So you're like 6 feet from the panda with a
wow.
panel of glass between you. And it's very cool. So even if you're not going to go to Sichuan where you can cuddle with the baby pandas, which I definitely want to do, I've heard that it's incredible. You should definitely go to some zoo there. And I think a lot of the zoos have pandas there because it's China.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely go see that. Do you know about panda diplomacy, Jordan?
I don't know.
So every panda in the world is the property of the Chinese government
Really?
because pandas only live naturally in small areas in Sichuan province in China. And so they kind of use it as a diplomatic thing where zoos don't buy pandas, they lease pandas from China, and they can revoke your panda if your country upsets them. And they have done that before, or like given countries pandas to earn favor and stuff, which is why only a couple of zoos in America have pandas, only a few zoos in other countries have pandas, but a lot of Chinese zoos do.
I
Excuse me.
wonder if something like that is what happened at the San Diego Zoo, because the San Diego Zoo was famous for their panda exhibit, and then I think like a year or two ago, they got rid of it.
That's possible. They could have gotten there because pandas, zoos that have pandas outside of China, it's
That was their
often
most famous attraction.
it's often like their biggest money pot. That's what people go there for.
Yeah, so now it's the tigers.
Yeah, so I can't imagine that they would have voluntarily given it up. So yeah, maybe they got their pandas revoked for some reason. Maybe there was some diplomatic scuffle that they pulled the San Diego pandas.
That's so crazy. I'd never heard of
Yeah.
that before.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap up the show now. I really learned a lot during this podcast, and I'm sure our listeners will learn a lot too. Thanks again for your time, Ian. You're an extremely thoughtful and insightful guy, and we'll definitely do another podcast soon. I want you to take a time now to go ahead and explain to our listeners how to find your channel and a little bit of the projects that you have coming up.
Yeah, so we make a lot of media. So we make YouTube videos. I have a website where we post blog posts weekly, and we're trying to ramp that up. I'm trying to gonna try to get some more writers on there. Right now it's just me writing, so I write once a week on that. We have a newsletter that we send out every Friday, and we have a Quora space. If you know what Quora is, it's a platform where you kind of have like people ask questions and then people write answers, and sometimes things are really cool. So we have a space where I've got contributors and moderators and people post things in that. We do live streams and we do weekly news recaps. If you're gonna subscribe to one thing, subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/The Lucretia Report, LUCRETIA. If you want to find all the rest of our stuff, you can find it all at lucretiareport.com. Again, LUCRETIA report.com. And you can find links to our videos there. You can find links to our live streams there. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can read all our blog articles and find all our social medias. We've got some cool stuff coming up. We're going to on Saturday, we're going to be putting out a video about how Law and Order, the phrase Law and Order, became a dog whistle of like oppression, how it came to be like a phrase that people use to push back against social movements that threaten the status quo. And we're gonna have a lot more cool stuff like that coming up. Pretty soon I want to start spinning off my interviews that I do live streams into a podcast. I'm not sure when that's gonna happen. I'm hoping to do that pretty soon. But yeah, if you want to subscribe to one thing, subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/The Lucretia Report, and you can find all of our stuff at lucretiareport.com.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. And I'll go ahead and provide a link to your YouTube channel in the description for this podcast. Once again, thanks for coming on the show, and you have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you. Did we go long enough?
Yeah, we're totally long enough.
Okay, cool. I wasn't shit. Felt like less time than last time, so I was like, ooh, should we? Okay.
It was definitely less time, but I think it's because we were a little bit more on script.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, cool.
All right, take it easy.
Yeah, let me know if everything works out with that, and send me a link when you've got it published, and I'll post it around my socials.
You got it.
Cool. All right, talk to you later, man.
All right, take it easy, man.